perspective of women living under the Taliban. Before we get started...
هر روز ما با سختیه.
مخاطبان روزنامه 8 صبح می توانند خبرهای افغانستان و جهان را از زمینه اینترنتی این روزنامه دریافت کنند. همچنان آدرس های روزنامه 8 صبح.
Finally, for those of you who can stay after the event, we have reserved the rooftop upstairs for some networking and socializing. Unfortunately, those that are joining online, we can't receive questions online. So I did want to announce that if you are joining us online and have questions, to please email my colleague Marjan at Marjan, MARJANM at ned.org with your questions. And then when it comes to the question and answer period, she can read those questions then. I'd like to start by introducing our keynote speaker today. We are thrilled to have with us and introduce Ms. Rina Amiri, the U.S. Special Envoy for Afghan Women, Girls, and Human Rights. Under the Obama administration, she served as Senior Advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Ms. Amiri brings over 2 decades of political expertise, advising and working with governments in various conflict settings in West and the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, Central and South Asia, and Europe. Her areas of focus are peace and security with a specialization in inclusion and mediation processes. Ms. Amiri has served in the UN in several capacities, including as senior mediation expert and a member of the UN Special Representative of the Secretary General's political team in Afghanistan during the leadership of the Bonn Agreement. She has also held senior leadership positions in a variety of universities and think tanks, including the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, Princeton University's Innovations for Social Societies, and New York University Center for Global Affairs. As a senior fellow at the Center for International Cooperation, she led the Afghanistan and Regional Policy Initiative. She has championed the rights of Afghan women and girls for decades and is a founding member of Inclusive Security, a global women's initiative advocating for the inclusion of women in peace process. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Amiri.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by thanking all of you for being here during Women's History Month at a time that continues to be extraordinarily challenging in Afghanistan. I want to thank NET as well as ODI for their continued efforts and keeping Afghanistan in the spotlight. And I would like to thank DROPS for the extraordinarily good work that they do, that they continue to do in an environment that makes research very difficult. Your work is very important. The data-driven approach is essential. Right now, we are looking at another milestone, a tragic milestone. In a couple of days, schools will be opening up in Afghanistan. And once again, girls will not be able to participate in education in Afghanistan. It is a heartbreaking situation. It is the most extreme situation in the world for women and girls. It is a context that we have to remember. The only precedent, in fact, is the Taliban themselves. There's no precedent, there is no comparison in terms of what we see in Afghanistan. It is not something that any Muslim majority country has noted would be acceptable within the sacred tenets of Islam. It has been repudiated globally. What we have to remember is that this is not something that is just about women and girls. It is about Afghanistan. It is about the model it sets for the region and the rest of the world. What happens in Afghanistan does not just stay in Afghanistan, and we have to remember that. We also have to remember that the repercussions are not just faced by women and girls, but the entire population of Afghanistan. It has had already enormously devastating impact on an economic level. UNDP assesses that it has already cost Afghanistan over $1 billion. The fact that women and girls are kept out of education and work. It has an impact in terms of the stability of the country. Any country in which women and girls are erased is a country that creates a fertile ground for extremism and radicalization. We have to look at what is happening on human rights and the rights of women and girls as one that is of our strategic interest to address. We have to look at security in an inclusive way, as the DROPS report emphasizes. We cannot talk about an improved security situation in Afghanistan when over 50% of the population feel tremendously insecure. When you see the rights-based community, when you see minority groups facing a level of insecurity that does not give them any type of sanctuary. They feel insecure in their homes. They feel insecure in their communities. They feel insecure any time of the day in which they are, when which they're consistently subject to scrutiny, and that has ramifications for the society at large. We have to collectively speak about the situation of women's rights and human rights in those strategic terms. It is critical from a normative perspective, but it's much more. We as who work on human rights need to change the way that we frame our discussions. And we, the diplomatic community, need to integrate women's rights and human rights in a meaningful way, and the way that we define our strategic objectives. I want to talk a little bit about what we are doing in our office to work towards those ends. One, at the diplomatic level, and every meeting that I've participated in, this is the message that I've taken. We cannot talk about security, an improved security situation in Afghanistan, when the situation continues to grow increasingly menacing for the majority of the Afghan population. And that we, as a collective community, we bear a responsibility for ensuring that when we talk to the Taliban, that we talk about women's rights and human rights in a way that they understand this is not just simply a talking point, that this is not an issue that can be siloed or deprioritized, but that at every level we have to signify to the Taliban that they will not achieve their goals towards normalization, towards making progress on any of their objectives in a meaningful way, unless they address the demand of the Afghan population to have their rights respected. Two, I think it's absolutely critical that we collectively recognize some of the mistakes of the past. You know, any time that a policy is made on Afghanistan without the voices of Afghans meaningfully integrated as experts, we're failing in the work that we do. And now it's even more critical because we don't have visibility in the ground. We don't have a presence on the ground. And out of the tragedy of Afghans once again being forced into exile, we have expertise in many of our countries, as well as the capacity to engage Afghans inside the country. The extraordinarily challenging situation in Afghanistan requires out-of-the-box thinking. It requires Afghans who to guide us and to lead us on how we can creatively advance policies that actually meet their interests in a way that can be meaningfully implemented. To do that, we need to identify mechanisms to bring the voices of Afghans into our policymaking. To that end, on our part, we have set up the U.S.-Afghan Consultative Mechanism, which is a mechanism to meaningfully bring in the voices of women and civil society into our policymaking. We've also encouraged other countries to do the same. And I'm encouraged now that there are a number of different platforms. The EU has a platform. The UK has put together various consultation forums. And there are many other countries that are doing the same. In fact, a couple of months ago, when I organized a group of countries that were doing work to this, and there were 6 countries in addition to the EU that had set up similar platforms to bring in the voices of women in civil society. And we have said that anywhere where there's a forum in which a discussion is taking place on Afghanistan, there has to be a meaningful way of bringing Afghans to the table in that discussion, particularly women and girls. I was very heartened at the last UN convened special envoys meeting that when the Taliban demanded that the Secretary General withdraw the invitation to women in civil society for their participation, the Secretary General rejected that proposal. And women in civil society did participate, and I was also really pleased that the number of women were larger than the number of men in that meeting, and that they were able to meaningfully sit down with the special envoys and bring many of the points that that have been noted in the report. And particularly, they put an emphasis on how we should be looking at the security lens in Afghanistan and why it matters to have a gendered perspective on security. 3, we need to identify how to meaningfully help Afghans inside the country through concrete efforts. Every day that these policies continue is Afghans being deprived of opportunity and of the space to actually make meaningful changes in their lives. What I hear from Afghan girls when I speak to them is that they feel that any effort that we can put in place, whether it's through support for virtual education, hybrid education, scholarships, it is essential oxygen. It engenders hope, and hope is a vital currency that we have to support. It is not sufficient to just work at a concrete level. The edicts have to be reversed, but in addition to the diplomatic work that we do, we have to identify how to provide concrete support. And one of the things that Afghans have increasingly been calling for is more accountability measures. Last week at CSW, there were a number of different forums in which Afghan women leaders gathered and assembled and noted that the way that the situation in Afghanistan is being described is not fit for purpose, that there needs to be a better understanding of the tools that need to be considered, to be evaluated, and to be potentially brought to the table in terms of bringing accountability to the Taliban and recognizing the severity of the situation in a way that is meaningful, and a way that takes into account that this is the most extreme situation in the world. I want to keep my comments short. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the speakers themselves. But again, we need to remember that the Afghans that we invest in today is going to determine the Afghanistan of the future. The work that we are talking about is of a strategic imperative to all of us. Thank you very much.
To the panel section of our discussion, so I'm going to invite our panelists to join me on stage. Yeah, please go ahead. Thank you, Ms. Amiri, for that wonderful opening remarks that underscores how critical this issue is from a broader strategic perspective, and how critical it is to view security from a gender perspective, and also for sharing your kind of key outline for how to have more tangible participation of Afghans and Afghan women and girls in these discussions. We have a wonderful panel with us today to discuss the implications of a new report by the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, DROPS, and ODI on changing social norms around age at marriage in Afghanistan. The research finds that the Taliban are deepening the drivers of early and forced marriages. Their edicts and restrictions are re-entrenching social norms that were beginning to change over the 20 years before 2021. One of these norms was growing acceptance of a higher marriage age at 18 and above. This research highlights the gendered experiences of insecurity beyond active combat, which we hope international policymakers will keep central to their deliberations around international engagement with the Taliban. To help us understand the realities of Afghan women and girls and the current international context, I'm honored to introduce this conversation with our panelists who will help us unpack this research and its implications. It's my pleasure to introduce Maryam Safi, the Executive Director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies and co-author of the report. DROPS is a research organization that was established in Afghanistan in 2014. Dr. Aisha Khan is a senior research fellow at ODI, where she focuses on gender and development and is also a co-author of the report. She's currently working on feminist movements and backlash to gender equality as it's unfolding in the global South in the context of democratic rollback and closing spaces. And finally, Dr. Nilüfer Saki, who is a professional lecturer of international affairs at Elliott School at George Washington University. Nilüfer is a scholar and practitioner of security and peace. With that, I think we'll kick off the conversation with Mariam, asking you to help us kind of understand what evidence your research provides about what has changed for women and girls and social norms and what that means for their security since the Taliban takeover.
Thank you very much, Amira. First, on behalf of our organization, DROPS, I would like to extend my deepest gratitude to our long-term partner, the National Endowment for Democracy, for making today's event possible and always standing with their commitment to help advance the plight of Afghan women and girls. And we're truly appreciative and grateful for your efforts. And a deep gratitude to Ms. Rina Amiri for joining us today and offering those very impactful, welcoming remarks, as well as our fellow expert panelists. Thank you so much. Before I delve deeper into our study, I would like to ask our NED colleagues if they could play a short video for you to give you a glimpse into some of the key findings of this study that we conducted with ODI. Thank you. As you've just witnessed, our research shows quite an alarming trend where families are increasingly marrying off their daughters as the next best thing following the ban on education. With the ban on education, this has basically stripped away girls from delaying marriage and using that as a reason for marriage later, saying, oh, when I finished my studies, and then families were tending to agree. Hence, we saw a slight decrease in the last 20 years during the Republic when it came to the issues of forced and early child marriage. Then there's also the component of employment. And families in particular, where there's more than one daughter, and now they no longer can work and contribute to the income of the household, families, because of the poverty and humanitarian crisis, are now more inclined to marry off their daughters as soon as they could. And lastly, in terms of mobility, when women can only leave their homes with a mahram, then that becomes a pushing factor for families to marry their daughters off forcefully at times. Meaning, by force, I mean their decisions are not taken into, their choice is not taken into consideration. Now, the general sense of insecurity in the country is both physical and it's livelihood insecurity. And these are all the components that kind of encapsulate this, the reasonings behind why we see early forced marriages of girls. And another shocking finding is that families are using marriage as a form to protect their girls from forced marriages to the Taliban. Now, when we were doing our focus groups, we found two types of cases. One is the scenario where Taliban are using intimidation tactics and are pursuing girls. At times, like you saw with the focus group quote, women that are engaged. And other times, they're using local religious scholars in villages and in districts to identify households that have daughters that are not married as of yet, and they may be above the age of 16 and above, or widows. And then that gets reported back to the Taliban in what we hear, and then those homes get approached. And so there is both an actual threat, but then there's also the perceived notion of threat. One thing that all of my Afghan colleagues here will understand is this common sentence that was articulated to us in the focus groups. Alat kharabas, alat kharabas, meaning the situation is bad. And so that also is one of those key drivers. But lastly, despite this incredibly dire and harrowing situation, our focus group respondents were still able to identify some small but meaningful acts of resistance to the everyday, to the Taliban's gender persecution. And we have an entire chapter on resistance, which I think is quite fascinating. I urge you to take a look at it, where they report a mosaic of low-level clandestine activities that bring hope and also resist oppression, centered on whether it's online education, income generation within the home, and also solidarity networks at the very, very local level, and it could be a bit of at the macro level as well, that continues to support them in resisting what they see and what they're faced with on an everyday basis.
Thanks, Mariam. Aisha, as the co-author of this report, can you elaborate a little bit more on where you see the Taliban's gender persecution fitting into kind of broader backsliding on women's rights globally?
Thank you. That's an important question, because when I met Mariam at ODI and we were thinking about how to work together, I thought that the story of what's happening with women and girls in Afghanistan is not just a story of that particular country's very troubled and difficult history, but it's a story that fits into the global narrative around the backlash against gender equality that we're experiencing. And all over the world, countries are contending with backlash, but in different ways, because every country has its own trajectory, its own history of struggles with issues around gender equality and inclusion. But I felt it was really important to highlight what is happening right now and amplify the voices of women from inside Afghanistan in order to warn the world that this rollback of gender justice and the rights that have been gained are perhaps the most egregious example of backlash that we see in the world today, but it could be, it could foretell a very dark future for the rest of us if we don't address this in the best possible way. So it's not an outlier. It is a story of how the Muslim world has struggled with its own politics around democratic inclusion and religion, and how women fit into the story of unfolding and building nation states under very challenging circumstances. So the way in which we handle Afghanistan is a really important struggle for particularly countries in the Muslim world. So secondly, the way this story also links with anti-rights movements is that the research on anti-rights and backlash is increasingly discovering, of course, and unfolding the financial trails and the money and the politics that have been going into building the anti-gender equality policy moves around the world, led from, of course, partly in Western Europe, Russia, and the United States, but less attention has been drawn to how the Muslim world has been funding its own anti-gender equality work for decades. And I thought that the story of the Taliban actually fits into that much more significantly. Therefore, the challenge is how to deal with the rise of religion in public and political life in Muslim countries, in South Asia, in Afghanistan, because these are questions that we wrestle with, but to resolve those questions means also resolving how we are going to deal with the role of women in public life and how do we ensure women's voices if we are actually demanding inclusive participatory democracies. So yeah, this is just in short why I felt this was a very important research study. And finally, just to close, to frame our evidence or to base our evidence always on the centrality of women's voices, rather than other voices stepping in saying, no, this is what we want, what women should want, or how to include women. It was really important for Mariam and I to work together to collect data that is only based on the perspective of women and the real life experience that they're having as a story of backlash, and how backlash and anti-democratic forces work together in the most extreme circumstances.
Thank you. Nilüfer, I'll turn to you and would love to hear your thoughts on what you see as the implications of this study and research on reframing security from a gendered perspective.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Amira, and thank you, Annette, for having me in this very important discussion. Well, first of all, well done for the report. There's an amazing report. I was going through the report. I found first about some technical aspect I wanted to mention here, which is extremely needed in today's field of research. I mean, the data collection method that you adopted, this snowball sampling and focus group, I think that was very relevant to the context and the current context, and that made representative the report. Though the report was, the research was conducted in 11 provinces, but in 4 zones of Afghanistan, that snowball sampling of findings, people with similar characteristics, I think that made it very representative. And the focus group, I think that made the discussion, when I was going through all the interviews, the focus group made the discussion very focused. So I think that was, the effectiveness of this and the representation of the population, which you can see from the report and as from technical perspective. Well, I saw the report from security lens, and I wanted to see how I actually read twice the interviews and the results of the interviews, both the analytical component of it and then the people direct quotes. What I found in that is there are two, as Mariam John mentioned, there is a perceived notion of insecurity and actual insecurity. The perceived notion of insecurity is overall associated with who is in power. The group which is in power, that is brings instability. I mean, the characteristics of that, the regime in power, that itself bring kind of instability to the eyes of the people, particularly women, in terms of what they will do and how they will react, and overall the nature of the regime itself. That is kind of a created perceived insecurity. What I analyzed out of some other interviews, that there are also actual insecurities, and actual insecurity is caused by of course, whatever is happening in terms of detention, intimidation, suppression, operation by the leading group, and also the decrees. The decrees also created an actual insecurity in women's life, and that is those decrees are kind of policy. They are, and I'm scared that if this will continue, that will be normalized as the norm is mentioned a lot in the report. And I remember in 2002 when we started, and actually it's sad that we are starting everything from scratch, because in 2002 I remember we were going to different villages of of the Western region with one of the programs I started at that point. And we were trying to find out those norms, unwanted norms that impacted women's life. And it's unfortunate that we are starting everything from scratch in Afghanistan context. So yeah, the perceived and actual notion of insecurity, that was an important element. I think that we need to really talk a lot about it from both from general population's view and lens, and also in particular from women. The other word which I found a lot repeated in the report, which is quite so much is linked with the insecurity, with the whole definition of insecurity, is fear. The word fear has been used a lot by the respondents, and also in the analytical component, you see the fear. Fear is the root of insecurity. Fear actually is the indicator of insecurity. Fear of being killed, fear of being detained, fear of losing someone, losing your loved ones. So that word fear is used a lot. So therefore, the context gets so clear from the interviews, the context of insecurity, which is insecure. Maybe the armed conflict has reduced because, of course, the party in armed conflict is in power right now. Maybe that component has reduced. That's not all a bit. We don't have really concrete reports. But overall, if we seek security from a comprehensive lens, an intersectional lens, the nature of security evolved after the Taliban takeover. And these are the indicators that women highlighted. These are the indicators that analyzed in this report that we can clearly define that the nature of insecurity have changed. And this insecurity, as it was highlighted by Special Envoy Amiri, that they are the causes of radicalization. They will be the causes of we don't know. I mean, at some point, armed conflict, if we will link all the pieces together. So yes, from the reports, from the interviews, it gets very obvious. The security landscape very obvious. The wording used by the interviewees, and each word indicate either the root cause of insecurity or the indicator of insecurity. So I'm glad that this discussion is coming up, reframing security, because that's exactly what Afghanistan needs at this point. The nature of security has evolved, and I'm glad organizations like NED and others put forward this whole concept. I hope this discourse will continue with more data-driven information that from Afghanistan, how people define insecurity and how they feel protected in their communities or under such regime. I think that would help donors, that would help policymakers in order to develop concrete policies based on what people need, or overall based on what has to be changed both at the top and the bottom. I stop there.
Thank you. Speaking of data-driven research, DROPS through Bishnau has been surveying Afghan women across 26 provinces for many years now. Mariam, do you have any final observations or reflections on how this data compares to past findings from your work through Bishnau?
Well, for us, interestingly, what we find in every single data collection phase, and our data collection phases are bi-monthly. We conduct telesurveys, face-to-face surveys, and focus group discussions on a bi-monthly basis through our Bishnau initiative. And we make this data available to everyone on Bishnau's website. And when we've done we've surveyed a little over, since the fall of the Republic, we've surveyed a little over 30,000 women on different topics: humanitarian aid, security, prioritization of needs, political participation, sanctions, gender apartheid, mental health. And in each one, you see a common thread. And that common thread is what Dr. Sakhi just mentioned, being that component of fear. Now, I can give you an example of this, especially when we did our survey with mental health, which was in March of last year. For Afghan women, when we've asked them how they define security, they do not define security through the traditional lens of security. The way they define their security is whether they have psychological security, do they have emotional security, do they have mental security? And that is something that they are quite vocal about, that they do not have. So for them, they don't feel secure. They don't feel secure inside of their homes, and let alone outside. Now, when we ask them about traditional security, And we did this survey in in July of 2022. 36% of women reported feeling a degree of unsafety when going out in public. Now, when we asked them if they felt that the security, traditional security in their provinces had improved, 43.7% said yes. So they were quite honest. Yes, physical security in terms of bombs and IEDs and attacks had decreased, of course, because the perpetrators are no longer committing those crimes. However, when you go into the focus groups where we started asking them and probing deeper into how they look at security, how they define security, the majority of our focus group participants contradicted these statistics. And so what they said was they argued that traditional security was improving somewhat, but argued that statistics hide a grimmer reality and the atmosphere that is shrouded with uncertainty and fear. They said that they do not have any mental or emotional sense of security inside or outside. And so even when we did our study on early and forced and child marriage, we found that insecurity was a major driving factor. And so this brings us to a very clear and concrete conclusion that women's key priority continues to be their rights. And this is a constant theme, no matter what survey we've done. And you can see these for yourself. And so for them, women's rights are above access to humanitarian aid and above reducing poverty and above traditional security. And so this becomes clear that for Afghan women, their sense of security and their reality of security is tied with their rights, period. So if you take away their rights and their freedoms, you've taken away their sense of security. And it kind of surprises me that we are trying to convince certain stakeholders that women feel insecure because they don't have rights, and that at this time in our trajectory, they are still equating security with traditional security. And so it becomes it's quite a frustrating a cycle to be in, and I don't think it's that hard to understand or believe. And so if there's one thing I like to leave you with today, is that Afghan women's sense of security is tied to their rights, and those rights being protected, period.
Thank you. Aisha, Mariam talked about kind of the impact of this democratic rollback in Afghanistan on women there. You previously talked about this global democratic rollback, and what is your kind of, what are some of the trends or similarities that you're seeing from the impact on women in Afghanistan with the impact of this democratic rollback more globally?
Well, one feature of the de-democratization that is happening globally is, as I mentioned earlier, the greater infusion of religion in public life and religion in, of course, policymaking and political discourse and rhetoric, which has a very gendered interpretation when it comes to the rights of women. Another is that the rise in authoritarianism is also bringing with it a rise in patriarchal values and highly misogynistic political discourse. You hear, of course, in the Western world about preservation of family values, traditional roles for women, and that is upheld as an ideal. But if you look at it if you zoom back and look at it from an understanding of democratic spaces, you see that this is actually a discourse that is trying to push women back into the public domain and private domain and remove them from the public domain. And what the Taliban have done is, in effect, put that into brute force and said women actually can't leave the home, basically, and they cannot engage in public life. So that is the most extreme example of what politicians in other parts of the world are trying to kind of more insidiously bring about, but it's a return of women to the private domain, and it's an idea that women belong best in their roles, in their social reproductive roles. So that is one warning sign to consider. Another is that Part of the rise in authoritarianism and the rollback of democracy involves shrinking civic space. And in shrinking civic space, silencing media, silencing the ability of civil society to advocate for governments to be more transparent and accountable, it also silences feminist movements and the ability of women to get together and act collectively in order to advance their rights, not only in the global South, but of course in the West as well. Now you see in Afghanistan, the pushback of women from all public spaces, whether it was, when there was a slight democratic opening, there was a quota for women in the legislative assembly, suddenly women were able to advance in public life in unprecedented ways. The shutdown of those spaces has also disallowed women from engaging in collective action. So when women cannot engage in public space and collective action, how can they advocate for their rights, especially from an unaccountable regime? So these are examples of how you have to understand democratic processes and link what is happening in Afghanistan with what is more broadly happening globally.
If I may ask just a follow-up question.